Hey guys, this is day 5 of Max and the Gatekeeper. It's getting pretty intense. Let's see what happens. Okay, so let's review really quick. So Max and Marco got away. They know kind of where Cindy is. They got past the nightshades, and they were back in the cave, or they're going back to the cave. What do we do now? Max whispered. We need to get back to the cave. Marco waved Max farther back into the tent as a large man approached. He stepped through the door and sniffed. Max froze as the man turned towards him and their eyes met. Then the man's eyes rolled back in his head and he fell unconscious to the floor. Marco stood over him holding a short black stick. He dragged the man deeper into the shadows. They waited a few more minutes. The fires were spreading and the smoke was growing thicker. Marco looked up to the sky. We need to head west, Marco pointed. Which way is the cave? Max's heart sank when Marco signaled in the opposite direction. Why do we need to head west then? Because the smoke is drifting west, and it'll give us cover. We need to keep out of sight until things settle down. Marco glanced at Max's hand. I forgot about your injury when I had you put that stuff on. It must have burned like crazy. It still does. I'm sorry, but it had to be done. Now let's get out of here. Marco moved to the back of the tent, lifted up the bottom, and they slipped away. They crept along a narrow pathway between the backs of 2 rows of tents. Max watched his footing so that he didn't trip on the guide ropes, unlike Marco, who navigated them without paying obvious attention. Angry shouts and calls rang out everywhere. When they arrived at the last tent in that row, Marco paused to check the pathway. After a moment, he darted across the road into another alleyway with Max on his heels. Halfway down the alley, Marco motioned Max to wait. He ducked into a tent and emerged with a torch in his hand. He used it to start the surrounding tents on fire. He beckoned Max to follow, and they continued on their way. Marco torched every tent they passed. When they reached the end of the alley, they stepped out into the main thoroughfare. Judging by the size of the tents, Max decided it must be near the center of the camp. Marco eyed a grand tent and threw the torch onto the middle of its roof. Marco eyed a grand tent and threw the torch into the middle of its roof. The fire spread with several sparks jumping onto the surrounding tents as they dashed away. The smoke choked Max's lungs. Not only did he have the smoke to contend with, but the stuff on his face still reeked. Various creatures rushed by them, but the low-hanging smoke made it hard to see. Everything was hazy, gray, and distorted. No one paid any attention to them. After walking for a while, the tents decreased in size again, and the smoke-thickened air thinned out. Either the wind wasn't pushing the smoke this far, or the fires were out. Max decided it was a combination of both. He was sure they were using magic to extinguish the fires. They traveled without interruption until a tall beast with a wolf-like head advanced into the street, blocking their path. He was a foot taller than Marco, with muscular, hairy arms. Who are you, and where are you going? None of your business, Marco responded, his hand sliding into his poncho. I've got my orders, so it is my business. You better answer before someone gets hurt. The beast crowded Marco in a threatening manner. Marco's hand exploded out of his cloak like lightning, his movements a blur as his short black stick crashed down on the beast's forehead. Just as fast as the stick appeared, it disappeared. The wolf-like beast stared straight ahead as it fell. The crowds huddled around campfires, eyed them as the beast collapsed. They acted surprised that the thing toppled over. But with the poor light and the speed of Marco's hand, they didn't seem to know what had happened. Can't hold his liquor, Marco said to the onlookers. Marco nodded for Max to follow. As they approached the edge of the camp, cries fractured the night air. Lower your hood. Marco removed his hood. What? Do it now. Show them we have nothing to hide, Marco ordered, and Max obeyed. It surprised Max that Marco had somehow disguised his face. He could have sworn Marco wasn't wearing anything a moment ago. Now something like a mask or a spell transformed his distorted his face. A piercing shriek rang out above their heads and grew louder. A gargoyle-like bird flew past and then zoomed away. A group of the enemy, organized like fighting troops, hustled up the street toward them. Marco continued to push straight ahead at a steady speed. Max held his breath as the soldiers jogged by. They didn't slow down or look like they were interested in them. He exhaled when the group was out of sight. Before they reached the edge of the camp, Marco headed south. Why did Marco turn? It was only a short distance and they would have been out of the camp. Max wanted to ask Marco so badly that he coughed to get his attention. Marco didn't respond but continued to walk in a southerly direction. How are you holding up? Marco asked after a time. I'm getting tired and my hand hurts. Hey, why didn't we leave the camp? Because it would be too obvious if we were spotted circling the camp. He pulled out a water skin from under his cloak and handed it to Max. After you take a drink, use some to clean your wound. As Max rinsed his hand, the pain lessened. He was ready for a break. They had been avoiding capture for hours, and his feet were sore. What are we going to do now? We will turn east soon. We shouldn't have any trouble until we try to leave the camp. Max noticed how hideous Marco's face was. His eyes were like a rat's, with a nose that looked like something that had been cut off at the tip. He had long fangs that were a decaying black and yellow color. You'll have to teach me that spell someday. Spell? What spell? The one that changes your appearance. Oh, yes, I forgot, Marco said. We'll have to ask Yelka. He took the water skin from Max and drank. Marco led Max south before turning east. There was less excitement in the camp now. The only smoke in the air came from campfires. The enemy had extinguished the burning tents. The pain in Max's hand grew in intensity again. He couldn't decide if it was the smelly stuff or that he hadn't taken his medicine. He tried focusing on what they were going to do once they got back to Grandpa's. He hoped somebody had heard of the Zanozis so they could rescue Cindy. He prayed she was all right. Max wondered what time it was. It was still dark, but with the hazy sky, it could be early morning. All he knew was that it seemed like they'd been up for days, and exhaustion consumed him. After what felt like an eternity, the edge of the camp appeared less than a mile away. They hadn't passed anyone for a while, and Max imagined they would escape without incident. The sky changed to a dull gray, a hint of morning's dawn. When they were only a few yards away from the edge of the camp, Marco guided Max into a tent. Before Max could speak, Marco held a finger to his lips and pointed to the sleeping occupant. He waved Max to follow, and they ducked under the back of the tent so that they were behind the tents again. Marco put his mouth next to Max's ear. They're guarding the border. Marco negotiated the narrow path between the back of the tents with cat-like ease. Max struggled with the ropes as he had before. After a short time of sliding parallel with the border, Max heard voices. As they drew near the end of the tents, Max and Marco had to freeze a couple of times as someone patrolled by on the border ahead. They hid behind the last tent, separating them from the desert. The voices, which before were only a murmur, were now strong and clear. They discussed how a spy had penetrated the camp. By the sound of it, there were lots of guards and they were not happy. Marco and Max started jumping across the pathways and ducking behind tents in an effort to locate an area without guards. It took them a few minutes to find a place the enemy protected only intermittently. The real benefit was a mound of dirt outside the camp that could provide cover. Marco watched the guards' every move. He timed when they passed by and how long before they returned. Finally, Marco held up his hand and signaled to get ready. When Marco dropped his hand, they bolted for the mound of dirt across the border. Once there, they paused to see if anyone had noticed. After several moments of observing the guards continuing their normal patrol, they figured they were safe. Marco whispered in Max's ear, "See that pile of rocks about 30 yards away?" Max nodded. "When I move, follow me." Marco studied the guards again. "Go," he whispered, and like a cheetah he ran towards the rocks with Max right behind him. They continued sprinting from cover to cover until the camp was no longer in sight. They hustled to the cave to get their things. Marco changed his appearance back to his old self. "So, you know where Cindy is?" Marco asked as they retrieved their packs. "Well, I know the name of the people who have her. They are called the Zanozis." Marco's grave expression told Max it wasn't good news. "You know who they are?" "Yes, I know." "And?" "They are a race who likes blood sports." Marco retrieved his communicator out of his cloak. Max gazed with interest as Marco adjusted the dials. Are you telling Grandpa we're coming? Yes, and to open the gateway. Marco lifted the communicator. I wish I knew how to use my communicator. There hasn't been any time to teach you with all the recent events. Marco placed the communicator back under his cloak. He produced a lot of items from beneath the cloak. Max wondered how many things he had hidden under there. They slung their packs over their shoulders and were heading for the cavern entrance when the ground rumbled and everything went dark, as if someone switched off the lights. The darkness was so complete they couldn't see anything. Marco's voice echoed, Presage, and a fireball flew from his hand towards the mouth of the cave. The entrance was blocked. Okay, that's the end of a chapter. Our next one will be chapter 15, Grandpa's Adventure. So exciting! Bye, guys.